The waitress rolled her eyes and made a cruel joke about Donald Trump, not knowing he was the one who signed her paycheck. She spoke loudly, laughing as if she had the whole restaurant on her side, but her confidence was about to crumble. She had no idea that her words were about to bring her the most embarrassing moment of her life. What happens when you mock the owner of the very place you work at? Tune in, because what happened that night made her move from the state, abandoning her past life. The waitress who picked the wrong guest. The restaurant was elegant, filled with people who expected nothing less than perfection. Among them sat a well-dressed guest, calm and composed, completely unbothered by the world around him. His presence carried weight, but he wasn't there to show off. He was there to enjoy his meal in peace. Unfortunately, peace wasn't on the menu that night. The waitress, full of herself, had other plans. She wasn't just serving tables, she was ready to make a scene, and she had already chosen her target. Before we dive into what happened next, one thing is certain. Her words would come back to haunt her in a way she never saw coming, and this won't be the only shock of the night. At first, her remarks were subtle, just enough to get a few chuckles from nearby tables. Then, emboldened by the reaction, she went further. Her voice carried through the room, her tone dripping with sarcasm, as she made sure everyone knew exactly how she felt about a certain former president. She thought she was in control, that she had everyone on her side, but that confidence would cost her. She had no idea she was about to learn a lesson the hard way. People started shifting in their seats, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Not everyone was laughing anymore. The air grew heavier with each passing moment. Some diners exchanged glances, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, without raising his voice, the guest spoke. His words were sharp but measured, a reminder that class and dignity always outweigh cheap theatrics. The room fell into silence, every eye turning to the now frozen waitress. She stammered, her smirk fading. She had expected laughs, approval, validation. What she got was something very different. The guest calmly revealed the truth. She had just insulted the owner of the very restaurant she worked in. The realization hit like a freight train. A murmur swept through the crowd, shock rippling across every table. Faces that had once held amusement now looked at her with something else: disbelief, embarrassment. She had made a massive mistake, and there was no way to undo it. For the first time that evening, she had no words. Just moments ago, she had spoken with confidence, sure of her wit and charm, but now all of it had vanished. The restaurant manager, who had been silently observing from the side, finally made his move. His face revealed nothing, but his decision was firm. The waitress, who had been so certain of her own cleverness, now stood frozen, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. There was no taking back what had been said, no way to undo what had just happened. Everything happened so fast that she could hardly understand what was going on. The manager's voice was steady, not loud, not cruel, but firm in a way that told her there was nothing left to argue. The decision had been made. Before she could even gather her thoughts, she felt a light touch on her arm, guiding her toward the door. One step, then another, and suddenly she was standing outside. The night air was colder than she had expected, or maybe it just felt that way because of the heat rising in her face. Her time at the restaurant was over. No discussion, no second chance. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her words, but in the end, those very words had cost her everything. Inside, life moved on as if nothing had happened. The sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversations filled the room again, smoothing over the disruption like a stone sinking into water. The same coworkers who had laughed with her only minutes ago now avoided her gaze. Some turned away, pretending to be busy. Others, who had once enjoyed her sharp words, suddenly had no interest in acknowledging her at all. She had been part of their world, but now she was nothing more than an outsider. The guests, too, quickly lost interest. The laughter, the tension, the sudden end to it all, none of it mattered to them. They picked up their forks, sipped their drinks, and carried on as if she had never been there at all. And the man she had mocked? He did not gloat. He did not smirk or even glance toward the door as she disappeared. He simply continued his meal, his expression as calm as it had been before. It was as if the entire situation had been nothing more than a passing thought, something barely worth his attention. But that, more than anything, made the weight of her mistake feel even heavier. If he had shouted, If he had looked pleased with what had happened, maybe she could have fought back. Maybe she could have convinced herself that she had not lost, that she still had some control. But he did nothing, and that silence, that complete lack of reaction made it clear. She had made the wrong choice and there was no taking it back. She had assumed too much. She had believed her words were just playful remarks, harmless jokes, nothing that could truly hurt her. But respect is never something you get just because you demand it. It is something you earn, something you give before you receive. She had crossed a line without realizing it, and now she had to live with the consequences. You never know who you are talking to. Sometimes the person you think you can humiliate is the one with all the power. And when you realize that too late, there is no way to undo what has been done. But for her, the true weight of that mistake had only just begun to sink in. The impossible equation challenge. The classroom felt like a battlefield, everyone waiting for the first strike. Dr. Markham's glare was sharp as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the whiteboard, marker in hand. "All right, Mr. Trump," she said, voice dripping with challenge. "Since you have such strong opinions about mathematics, let's put that confidence to the test." The marker screeched against the board as she wrote, numbers and symbols piling up in a monstrous equation that stretched across the surface. A few students exchanged nervous glances, some even whispering. This wasn't just difficult, this was the kind of problem that sent even seasoned mathematicians into a cold sweat. She turned, smirking as she tapped the marker against the board. "Go ahead," she said, arms crossed. "Show us how it's done. Unless, of course, you'd rather sit down and keep talking about things you don't understand." The words stung, and the challenge was clear: humiliation or victory. The class held its breath, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment. But Barron didn't flinch. He stood up, calm as ever, and walked toward the board. His expression was unreadable, his movements steady. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. This was going to be good. She had deliberately chosen this problem, knowing full well that it required methods far beyond anything taught in the course. There was no way he could pull this off. Then Barron spoke, his voice even and controlled. "Before I begin, I'd like to point out that this problem has more than one approach. Would you prefer I use the standard method or a more efficient solution based on original work by Leibniz?" The room fell silent. Even she hesitated for a moment. "You've read Leibniz's original work?" she asked, the confidence in her voice faltering slightly. "Yes, in the original German. The translations lose some of the finer details." Barron didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This wasn't a bluff. He knew exactly what he was doing. He turned back to the board and without hesitation began to write. His movements were precise, his steps deliberate. The problem that had looked insurmountable moments ago now seemed to unravel under his pen. It wasn't just that he was solving it, he was explaining every step as he went, making it look almost effortless. The class watched in stunned silence, phones slowly being raised to record what was quickly becoming something more than just a math lesson. This first step, Barron continued, was first introduced by Euler in the 1700s. It simplifies what appears to be a complicated integral into something much more manageable. His hand moved across the board, the solution unfolding like a perfectly orchestrated plan. Even students who had struggled with basic calculus before found themselves following along. Dr. Markham, arms still crossed, leaned slightly forward, her eyes darting between the board and Barron's face. She was trying to find a flaw, some mistake she could call out, but none appeared. Barron wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it in a way that made more sense than any lecture she had ever given. "Now," he said, nearing the final steps, "we have two ways to proceed. The traditional method would take up another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using a lesser-known principle from Leibniz's notes." He turned to face her. "Which would you prefer?" Her expression was unreadable, her earlier smugness completely gone. The class, still recording, waited for her response. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students, her voice hesitant but firm. "This actually makes more sense than how it was explained in the textbook." Barron smiled, nodding. "Of course." He turned back to the board and continued. She remained silent, watching as the student she had intended to embarrass took complete control of her classroom. The weight of the moment hung in the air. This wasn't just about solving an equation, it was about proving a point. By the time Barron finished, the entire board was filled, but his work was as clear and clean as a textbook example. He set the marker down and turned back to the class. "And that," he said simply, "is how it's done." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then slowly, a few students began to clap. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment. The classroom debate had already changed everything, but when Dean Richardson walked in, things took an even bigger turn. A professor's authority put to the test. The classroom door burst open with a loud bang, and in stormed Dean Richardson, a close supporter of her political stances. He barely took a breath before announcing, "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting. It's about the curriculum changes." The timing was absolutely terrible, or perhaps perfect depending on how one looked at it. She turned to her students, attempting to wrap up the session. "We'll continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to maintain authority, but before she could take a step, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you gave me a public challenge. You asked me to solve this in front of everyone," Barron said, his voice steady but firm. His words sent a wave of murmurs through the class, and even the dean hesitated. Leaving now wouldn't set the right example about academic integrity, would it? Silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Dean Richardson's expression darkened, his mouth tightening as if preparing for a scolding. "Young man, are you implying—" "I'm not implying anything, sir," Barron cut in, polite but unwavering. "I'm simply stating that Dr. Markham wanted to make a point about privilege and merit, and I accepted the challenge. The only question is, will she follow through?" The weight of the moment was undeniable. Some students had their phones out, capturing what was clearly turning into something bigger than a classroom debate. She glanced at the marker in her hand, then at the equation on the board, the same problem she had picked to supposedly expose a lack of ability. But now it was her own competence under the microscope. The dean, who had arrived as an authority figure, now found himself just another spectator. The tension grew unbearable. Barron, in a move that left everyone breathless, held the marker out to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said, a quiet challenge in his tone, "you'd prefer to solve it first. After all, you've made it clear that knowledge is what really matters. As our professor, surely you can walk us through the solution?" The classroom fell into a stunned silence. Her fingers tightened around the marker as if it had suddenly turned to lead. Her mind raced. How had this happened? How had the moment she designed to humiliate one student flipped into an interrogation of her own knowledge? The presence of the dean wasn't a shield anymore. It was a witness, a judge. Phones stayed lifted, capturing every moment. She started, then faltered. Her eyes darted to the board. The equation wasn't impossible, but under this kind of scrutiny, every second felt like a lifetime. Barron, unshaken, extended an olive branch. "We could solve it together. Collaboration often leads to better understanding." There was no mockery in his tone, no arrogance, just a genuine offer. But that made it even worse. Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take it. Her jaw clenched. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire stunt is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The class collectively exhaled, but the moment of tension didn't dissolve. It shifted. Now it was Barron's turn to pick up the pieces, or rather the marker. He bent down, retrieved it, and met Dr. Markham's fiery gaze with cool determination. "No," he said, voice unwavering, "this is about moving forward." And then, without another word, he turned to the board and did something that would leave the room breathless. In less than 5 minutes, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and an alternative approach. His movements were quick, precise, and completely unshaken. As he wrote the final number, the class exploded into applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his astonishment. But this wasn't the moment that would change everything. That came next. Dr. Markham stood there, her face drained of color, her carefully built reputation starting to crumble. Barron wasn't finished, though. He stepped back, facing both his professor and the dean. "Mathematics doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases," he stated, gesturing at the board. "It only cares about truth. And when we let personal agendas cloud our judgment, we miss the opportunity to grow. The dean cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that... Before he could finish, a voice rang from the back of the room. That what? It was Michael Chin, a quiet scholarship student who rarely spoke. That we should learn less math because of someone's political beliefs? The words cut through the air like a blade. And just like that, the classroom, the faculty, and the institution itself were forced to face a new reality. One where knowledge, not authority, would decide who held the real power. What started as a classroom argument didn't stay in the room for long. Soon, more people heard about it, and the whole school was watching. One lesson that redefined the classroom. Dr. Markham's class was supposed to be about calculus, but instead it had turned into something else entirely. Students were getting frustrated. One stood up and said they came here to learn math, not to get a lecture about privilege. Others nodded, their patience running out. The air in the room was thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed like Dr. Markham was losing control of the class. Then a student did something unexpected. He spoke up, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. He acknowledged that Dr. Markham knew a lot about math, but maybe they should stick to that instead of these other discussions. He even offered to help other students outside of class, blending theory with real problem solving. It was a lifeline, a way for Dr. Markham to keep control without backing down completely. The room fell silent, waiting to see what she would do. Dr. Markham hesitated. Her whole approach had been about challenging privilege and making students think about more than just numbers. But now, faced with the reality of their frustration, she had to make a choice. Slowly, she admitted she had been wrong. She had spent too much time focusing on one issue and had ignored what she was actually there to teach. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For the first time, she really saw her students for who they were, not just who she assumed they were. Then came the real shock. Students outside the class had started gathering. Word had spread fast. People were watching the drama unfold in real time, posting videos and reactions online. Soon, a crowd formed outside, holding signs with phrases like "Teach math, not politics" and "Merit over bias." The situation was about to explode into something much bigger than just a classroom debate. But the student who had spoken up wasn't done yet. Instead of letting things spiral, he walked to the door and spoke to the crowd. If they were here to learn, they should come inside. And just like that, students poured in, filling every seat and standing along the walls. Dr. Markham watched, stunned. She had been struggling to keep students engaged, and now, thanks to him, the room was packed with eager learners. What happened next became legend. He took the marker and turned the class back to what it was supposed to be: math. For the next hour, students listened, asked questions, and actually learned something useful. It wasn't about privilege or politics anymore. It was about numbers, equations, and real-world applications. And for the first time in a long time, Dr. Markham felt like she was truly teaching. The story spread across campus like wildfire. People expected it to be about a professor getting humiliated, but instead it became something else. Enrollment in advanced calculus skyrocketed. Dr. Markham, humbled by the experience, changed her approach. She went back to focusing on what she loved, teaching math. The student who had spoken up, true to his word, led study sessions and helped others bridge the gap between theory and practice. Was this professor trying to teach math, or was she using her position to push an agenda? And did she ever expect Baron Trump to outshine her so easily? Tell us what you think, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.